Imagine walking alongside a tranquil river when suddenly you see a black bag. You move closer and protruding from it is a human arm. This was the beginning of one of Chile's most chilling cases, a discovery that would unravel the tragic death of a young woman who had left Colombia in search of a better future. Today you will learn the truth about the femicide of Juliana Andrea Acevedo and what her killer confessed without a shred of remorse. On March 6, 2016, a man taking a quiet stroll along the banks of the Mapocho River in Chile stumbled upon something that would completely alter the course of his day. As he walked, his attention was caught by a black trash bag that seemed out of place, partially floating in the water and lodged between some rocks. As he drew nearer, he noticed something strange sticking out of the bag. His surprise gave way to immediate horror when he realized he was looking at a human arm. Shaken and frightened by the macabre discovery, the man wasted no time. He took out his phone and immediately called the authorities. Minutes later, several police officers arrived at the scene. They carefully opened the bag to inspect its contents, and the scene became even more disturbing. It wasn't just one arm. There were two arms and alongside them two legs. The condition of the remains and certain details quickly captured the officers' attention. They suspected the limbs belonged to a woman. The small size of the bones and muscles, the evident care taken with the nails and the neatly applied polish on the hands and feet, as well as several bracelets on one of the wrists, all reinforced this theory. Searching for clues to her identity, forensics experts took fingerprints from one of the hands. They ran them through the Chilean National Registry, but the results were disheartening. There were no matches. This led investigators to consider the possibility that the victim was not from Chile. They meticulously photographed the manicure, the design on the toenails, and several visible tattoos on the skin, hoping that someone somewhere might recognize her. The investigation took a turn the following day. Other people passing near the river found more black bags, similar to the first. When authorities examined them, they discovered the torso and head of the same victim. The cut marks matched perfectly with the limbs found the day before, confirming that all the remains belonged to a single person. The officers believed that with the complete body, identification would be simpler. However, the key didn't come from an official record, but from a much more personal detail. The unique design on her nails. A Colombian manicurist came forward voluntarily, telling the police she was certain she had created that exact design for a young woman who was also from Colombia. She couldn't recall many personal details, but she remembered the girl's first name, Juliana. She was also able to point them to the place where the young woman worked. With the lead provided by the manicurist, police officers went straight to the workplace of the potential victim. Once there, they approached the manager and, without revealing too many details to avoid compromising the investigation, showed him a photograph of the girl. The manager looked at the image carefully and had no doubt. He confirmed that he knew her well and that she did, in fact, work there. And just like that, the victim was officially identified as Juliana Andrea Acevedo, a 21-year-old woman originally from Colombia. The manager explained that Juliana hadn't shown up for work in several days. However, he hadn't been alarmed. He assumed she might be sick or perhaps had a family problem or a personal emergency. Nothing that would have made him think to report her missing. In the company's hiring records, the agents found the address where Juliana lived. It was an apartment building, and that became the next stop in the investigation. The police needed to find out not only what had happened to her, but also who this young woman really was and how she had come to Chile. As they dug deeper, more details about her life began to surface. Juliana Andrea Acevedo was born in Andalusia, Valle del Cauca, Colombia, in 1995. She was the youngest of 9 siblings. She had 5 brothers and 3 sisters, making her the 4th daughter. Her childhood had not been easy. Shortly after she was born, her father abandoned the family, leaving them in a very precarious financial situation. From then on, her mother had to bear the sole responsibility of raising and supporting all her children, an extremely difficult task. In 2014, Juliana finished high school. Her greatest dream was to go to university, but a lack of financial resources made it an unattainable goal at the time. Her family couldn't afford the expenses, and she was forced to put her academic aspirations on hold to start working. Her priority was to help at home and ensure that her siblings and mother had the basic necessities. In August of 2015, her romantic life took a turn when she began a relationship with 24-year-old Edwin Mauricio Valdés. Edwin was the son of a well-respected teacher in their town, and his family also owned a funeral home where he himself had worked on different occasions. He had spent most of his life with his mother, stepfather, and sister, as his parents had separated when he was still young. It was known that Edwin worked various odd jobs in town, without a fixed occupation, always looking for ways to earn enough money to get by. 4 months after they started dating, Juliana and Edwin made a momentous decision that would completely change the course of their lives. They would emigrate to Chile. The idea didn't come out of nowhere. Both had several friends who had already settled in the country and, according to their stories, had managed to significantly improve their financial situation. These accounts made them believe that if they tried, they could achieve the same success. For Juliana, this opportunity was more than just a change of scenery. Her goal was to start her university studies, a dream she had been forced to postpone. At the same time, she wanted to help her mother financially, who was getting older and still facing significant expenses. She also thought of her siblings, several of whom already had children and were not in a good economic position. In her mind, migrating was a way to stabilize her entire family's situation and ensure they wanted for nothing. Finally, in November of that year, the couple arrived in Chile. For the first few weeks, they stayed in a shared housing arrangement where several people live in small rooms and share common areas like the kitchen and bathroom. They remained there while they looked for work. It wasn't long before they both found jobs. Once they started earning enough to support themselves, they decided to take the next step and moved into an apartment together. During those months, Juliana maintained frequent contact with her family in Colombia. She told them that things were going well, that she had a job, and that she had even been able to send them some money to help with their expenses. She also mentioned that Edwin was employed and fulfilling his responsibilities. It's important to note that Edwin had a son from a previous relationship who lived in his hometown in Colombia, and he was expected to support the child as best he could. Despite their obligations, Juliana conveyed to her mother and sisters that life in Chile was unfolding as they had hoped. However, as the months went by, warning signs began to appear. Juliana confessed to one of her sisters that Edwin was becoming increasingly jealous. This behavior sparked a growing fear in her that he might eventually become violent. Worried, her sister advised her to seek help from a church in Chile, from people who could offer guidance or support. But Juliana didn't follow this advice and continued living with Edwin. That life together, which began as a shared dream, would end in the worst way imaginable. A short time later, the story culminated in a horrific discovery. Juliana's dismembered body found in bags thrown into the river. When the police arrived at the apartment building where Juliana and Edwin lived, they began walking the halls and knocking on doors to ask about them. Several neighbors mentioned that the couple had only been living there for a few months, but that their life together was far from peaceful. They recounted that arguments were frequent and intense, to the point that they weren't confined to the walls of their apartment. The shouting and insults could be heard clearly from other floors, and on more than one occasion they had witnessed altercations at the very entrance of the building in plain sight of everyone. The testimonies agreed that Edwin displayed a possessive and controlling character. One neighbor, with whom Juliana had managed to build some trust, revealed a telling detail. The young woman had given her cell phone to the neighbor to keep for her. Apparently, when she was at home with Edwin, she didn't use the phone, perhaps to prevent him from checking it. It's unknown if Juliana told Edwin she didn't have a phone at the time, or if she made up an excuse, but according to the neighbor, the goal was clear: to protect her privacy and keep him from accessing her conversations or contacts. The tense atmosphere was a daily reality, and fights were part of their routine. However, the neighbors recalled a specific detail. On Sunday, March 5th, the day before the first human remains were found, unusually loud music was heard coming from the couple's apartment. After that day, they never saw Juliana again. Edwin, on the other hand, was seen coming and going from the building repeatedly over the weekend and in the days that followed. With this information, the police went to Edwin's workplace to question him, but he wasn't there. So they decided to wait for him at the apartment building. When they saw him arrive, the officers approached, and Edwin, without resisting, surrendered voluntarily. At that moment, he openly confessed that he was responsible for Juliana's death. While all this was happening in Chile, Juliana's family in Colombia learned the news in the worst possible way. Not from the police, but through social media. When the young woman's limbs were found, photographs were taken of her hands and feet to aid in identification. Those images ended up circulating online and reached Colombia, where they were seen by Juliana's close friends. Although they didn't know for sure what manicure design she had at that moment, they recognized an unmistakable detail: the tattoo with her nephew's name that Juliana had on her ankle. As soon as Juliana's friends recognized the tattoo in the photographs and connected this clue with the news coming from Chile, they immediately notified the family. That is how her relatives found out, abruptly and painfully, what had happened. The tattoo was a perfect match. Considering the circumstances, they immediately assumed that the murdered young woman was her. Shortly after, official confirmation arrived when Chilean news outlets revealed the victim's identity. It was indeed Juliana Andrea Acevedo. The emotional blow was immense, and it was accompanied by another problem. The family did not have the financial resources to transport Juliana's body from Chile to Colombia. In their desperation, they began to seek help. They contacted national television stations, hoping that media coverage would raise awareness among authorities and the community. At the same time, they went to the Colombian consulate in Chile. Ultimately, it was the consular officials who initiated and managed all the procedures for the repatriation of her body. On March 15th of that year, Juliana's coffin arrived in her homeland. 2 days later, on March 17th, the burial took place. It was a massive ceremony. Approximately 500 people attended to say their goodbyes. Among them were family, childhood friends, neighbors, and acquaintances from the town. The Acevedo family was widely known and deeply appreciated in the community, which made the farewell a moment filled with affection, tears, and solidarity. While the funeral services were being held in Colombia, Edwin was facing the judicial process in Chile. In his statements to the police, he not only confessed to the murder, but also described his relationship with Juliana as having been violent for some time. He admitted to hitting her on several occasions, not only in their home but also in the middle of the street, regardless of who was watching. Furthermore, he revealed that he exercised constant control over her. He would often wait outside her workplace to watch her on his days off. And if his workday ended before hers, he would arrive early to wait and ensure they left together. He didn't want her to have contact with anyone but him, and on repeated occasions he forbade her from speaking to her family. This last claim was confirmed when investigators spoke with Juliana's relatives. They said they hadn't heard from her since the end of January. More than a month had passed since Juliana's last contact with her family in Colombia. During the interrogation, Edwin recounted this fact with absolute nonchalance, as if it were an insignificant detail. His tone, cold and distant, made it clear that he didn't feel he had done anything wrong. In his words, there was not the slightest trace of remorse. On the contrary, he seemed to describe the events as if narrating any other routine. He then proceeded to tell what had happened on March 5, 2016, inside the apartment he shared with Juliana. According to him, that day, while she was at work, she had spoken to someone, an act he found completely unacceptable. He claimed that when they returned home around 5 p.m., an argument began. At first it was verbal, but gradually the tone escalated, the words became more aggressive, and he moved from shouting to physical violence. He began to beat her repeatedly, and it ended in the most tragic way for Juliana. The subsequent forensic analysis confirmed the cause of death and revealed a detail that surprised the investigators. The signs of a precise and methodical hand were unmistakable, suggesting that the person responsible had knowledge or experience in this type of procedure. Edwin recounted to the authorities the steps he took after the crime. He explained that after Juliana's death, he manipulated the scene in the apartment, using tools to conceal what had happened. Finally, he placed the remains he wanted to dispose of into several plastic bags. Then, according to his confession, he made 2 trips to get rid of the evidence. On the first, during the same night as the murder, he discarded the limbs. On the second, he transported the torso and head. On both occasions, he used a taxi, and to transport the bags, he placed them inside a suitcase they had at home. Forensic analysis of the residence would later corroborate many of these details. In the bathtub, the use of luminol revealed multiple bloodstains, invisible to the naked eye but glaring under the chemical agent. Likewise, the suitcase Edwin had mentioned contained biological traces that, upon examination, tested positive for Juliana's DNA. This led investigators to the key question on everyone's mind. How had Edwin managed to make such exact and clean cuts on his victim's body? Initially, investigators suspected Edwin might have had help from an accomplice to perform such precise work. However, he flatly denied this possibility. He explained that his skill with such cuts came from personal experience, thanks to certain knowledge he had developed over time. He recounted how, back in Colombia, he used to help his father at the family-run funeral home, participating in tasks that required the use of sharp instruments and precision in handling bodies. Furthermore, he pointed out that in his home country he had been part of a so-called rural police. This was not an official body, nor did it belong to the armed forces or the national police, but rather a group organized by the residents of different communities. Their objective was to protect towns and areas with a high presence of crime, especially in places where, according to them, the formal police did not act effectively enough. In this environment, Edwin had learned to handle cutting tools and to make precise incisions on different parts of the body. This explained the chilling proficiency with which he had dismembered Juliana. Following this confession, he was formally charged with murder and sent to pretrial detention while the case was prepared. The investigation lasted a total of 9 months, and finally in 2017 the judicial process began. Edwin's defense sought a charge of simple homicide, which would have reduced the sentence to a range of 5 to 10 years in prison. The prosecution, on the other hand, demanded a 20-year sentence, arguing that the crime should be classified as femicide due to the romantic relationship between the victim and the perpetrator, coupled with the fact that they lived together. Under Chilean law, for a homicide to be considered femicide, it is necessary to prove the couple cohabited. In this case, proof was established through the lease agreement they had both signed, as well as their employment contracts, which listed the same address. After analyzing all the evidence and testimony, the court found Edwin guilty. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. The sentence was less than what the prosecution sought, reduced by 6 years due to several mitigating factors. He had turned himself in voluntarily, cooperated from the beginning by telling the truth, and did not resist arrest. The sentence was to be served in its entirety in Chile, after which Edwin would be deported back to Colombia. For Juliana's family, the news of the conviction brought mixed emotions. They never imagined that when she said goodbye to embark on a journey in search of a better future, it would be the last time they would see her alive. Much less could they have foreseen that instead of finding opportunities in another country, she would meet such a tragic end. To this day, her loved ones have not fully overcome the loss and remain convinced that the sentence imposed on Edwin was far too lenient for the irreparable harm he caused. The case of Juliana Andrea Acevedo is a stark example of intimate partner violence, coercive control, and femicide. Despite clear warning signs, abuse, extreme jealousy, isolation from family, and control of her communications, there was no timely intervention that could have prevented the fatal outcome. The investigation revealed the brutality of the crime, the coldness of the aggressor, and a sentence that, for many, felt insufficient compared to the magnitude of the damage caused. This event highlights both the vulnerability of migrant women to domestic violence and the limitations of the judicial system in delivering full justice to victims and their families. This case reminds us of the importance of recognizing and acting on the signs of violence in a relationship before they escalate to irreversible situations. It is crucial for victims and those around them to understand that control, jealousy, and isolation are forms of violence that can lead to grave consequences. It also underscores the need to strengthen mechanisms for protection, assistance, and reporting, so that no woman becomes trapped in a cycle of abuse, especially when she is far from her country and her support network. What warning signs do you think should never be ignored in a relationship? In your opinion, what measures should exist to better protect migrant women in another country? Do you think Juliana's family received the necessary support from the authorities? We want to know your opinion. Let us know in the comments.